Welcome to Anews. I'm Omer Taslim, and you're watching Turkey's Diplomacy. On today's episode, I'll be joined by Anews editor Mustafa Kocakınar and political analyst Javed Rana. We'll take an in-depth look into Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan's visit to Russia and analyze the latest developments from the war in Ukraine. But before we begin our discussions, let's take a look at this news report.
Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan held a high-level meeting with his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov in Moscow on Tuesday. The Turkish and Russian decision-makers discussed bilateral ties, regional stability, and pressing global issues.
We are working to ensure that our natural gas supply from Russia continues and that the Akuyu nuclear power plant becomes operational as soon as possible. We want to deepen our bilateral relations in a way that will not be affected by geopolitical challenges. We act with this understanding and will continue to take steps that will benefit our people.
Addressing the war in Ukraine, Fidan welcomed the recent prisoner exchange and voiced hope for a broader ceasefire, reaffirming Turkey's readiness to support dialogue and mediation efforts.
We are pleased that the exchange agreed upon in the peace talks was completed last weekend. We hope that the negotiations will quickly evolve into a ceasefire and a permanent peace in the future. As our president has stated to all parties, we are ready to provide all kinds of support in this process.
The people that we are talking about right now, of course, they want to damage these relations, because if this war ends, their political careers and they won't have any political future. It will end because they are egoists.
Turning to the situation in Gaza, the Turkish foreign minister delivered a firm message.
The ongoing genocide and human tragedy in Gaza must stop as soon as possible. Otherwise, as we have always stated, it is impossible for anyone to prevent the spread of a great chaos that will also include Israel. All this blood, tears and pain will not remain without results, and this must stop as soon as possible.
He also expressed support for the Syrian government's growing capacity to combat terrorism, emphasizing Ankara's backing for unifying military groups under a national army and command to help restore Syria's territorial integrity and security.
We see that the Syrian administration is improving its capabilities and opportunities in the field of combating terrorism and organized crime every day. We support efforts to bring all military groups together under a national army and central command.
Welcome to the program. Mustafa Kocakınar, welcome to the program as well.
Good morning.
Mustafa, let's start with the Turkish president's visit to Azerbaijan today. He's in Laçin, where he's going to meet Azerbaijan's President Ilham Aliyev and Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif. So what is this trilateral summit about? What is going to be discussed?
Omar, today Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan is paying an official visit to Azerbaijan to strengthen bilateral ties between Turkey and Azerbaijan. As you know, one nation, two states motto is defining the bilateral relationships between Turkey and Azerbaijan. And today, Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif will also participate in the meeting between Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and his Azerbaijani counterpart Ilham Aliyev. And it is crystal clear that Turkey, Azerbaijan and Pakistan are right now determined to strengthen their bilateral, multilateral cooperation to deal with the common security challenges in the Eurasia region. Today they are inaugurating Laçin airport. As you know, Azerbaijan liberated Karabakh from the Armenian occupation with the support coming from Turkey and Pakistan. And I think that today's meeting between Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Azerbaijani leader Ilham Aliyev and Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif will yield positive results in terms of addressing common security challenges in the region. Maybe they will sign several agreements to further deepen bilateral cooperation among these three countries. I think that strengthening of cooperation and collaboration among these three nations will yield positive results in terms of ensuring long-standing peace and stability in the Eurasia region.
Mustafa, the most important diplomatic event this week has been Hakan Fidan's visit to Russia, where he has met leaders. He has met President Putin, the lead negotiator Medinsky, and his counterpart Lavrov as well. Yesterday, there was a press conference, where Hakan Fidan and Sergei Lavrov discussed multiple different things. They spoke about Syria, they spoke about Gaza, they spoke about the European Union and how its leaders are not willing to end the war in Ukraine. But let's start with Syria, Mustafa. Lavrov said that we're ready to support Syria. As Russia, they're ready to support Syria in its reconstruction in order to bring the refugees back to the country, not only from Turkey, but from across the globe, wherever they have settled, during the civil war. So let's talk about the Syria issue first. Hakan Fidan has also said that Turkey is going to reiterate its support for Syria. So what are both sides looking for in Syria?
Well, as you mentioned, this week, Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan paid a two-day visit to Russia. He met with Russian President Vladimir Putin, his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov, and Russian delegation in Russia's capital, Moscow. The Turkish and Russian decision makers discussed all aspects of bilateral relationships between Ankara and Moscow, as well as exchanging views on the latest geopolitical developments in the Middle East, Syria in particular. As you know, security and geopolitical landscape changed in December in Syria as the opposition forces led by Ahmet al-Shara took control of the country. And since then, new rulers in Syria have been taking steps to normalize the political situation in the war-torn country. And this month, both the United States and the European Union decided to lift sanctions on Syria to facilitate Syria's reconstruction and rebuilding efforts. And yesterday, both Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan and Russian top diplomat Sergei Lavrov reiterated their country's determination to help Syria reconstruct and rebuild the country. Sergei Lavrov announced that Russia welcomed the sanction reliefs by the European Union and the United States for Syria. He stated that Russia also wants to engage in Syria's reconstruction efforts, and Turkey, as you know, always reiterating its strong support for Syria's political sovereignty and territorial integrity. Turkey is one of the most important countries supporting Syria's political infrastructure and economic infrastructure. I think that strengthening of cooperation between Turkey and Russia over Syria will yield positive results in terms of upholding a long-standing peace and tranquility in the war-torn Middle Eastern country.
Mustafa, of course, you mentioned terrorism. There's terrorism, and then, the sanctions relief that Syria got from the European Union recently and from President Trump a few weeks ago when he was in the Middle East. Now, Mustafa, let's talk about the Black Sea region, right? Hakan Fidan and Sergei Lavrov also discussed the Black Sea region, and they said, the security in the Black Sea should be increased. A few weeks ago, we saw that Russia and Ukraine, they both agreed to a deal. It wasn't a ceasefire deal, of course, but a deal which allowed both sides to stop their attacks in the Black Sea region. A key region, obviously, it's affecting Turkey as well. How is Hakan Fidan and the Turkish government, how are both of them looking at the security situation in the Black Sea region?
Well, as you know, Turkey has been enjoying close relationships with both Russia and Ukraine, because Turkey has neighbors with Ukraine and Russia through Black Sea region. And Turkey is controlling the security situation in the Black Sea region, because the Montreux Convention is allowing Turkey to control the security situation in the region. And in 2014, as you know, Russia illegally annexed Ukraine's Crimea region. No one from the Western countries and Turkey is recognizing the illegal annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation. And Turkey has been always calling for diplomacy and dialogue to facilitate the talks between the two warring sides to ensure long-standing peace and stability in the Black Sea region, because Turkish decision makers think that if there is something wrong in the Black Sea region, it will spread the chaos to the other areas in the world. Within this context, I think Turkey will continue to engage with both Russians and Ukrainians to ensure peace and tranquility in the Black Sea region. As you also mentioned about it, Ukraine and Russia reached ceasefire over Black Sea. I think that it is accelerating peace and tranquility efforts in the region. I think that all Black Sea stakeholders, including Romania and Bulgaria, will continue to take steps to help Turkey's efforts ensure peace and stability in the region. Yesterday, Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov also reiterated their country's determination to ensure peace in the Black Sea region. I hope that Turkey's diplomatic actions will continue to uphold peace and stability in the Black Sea.
Mustafa, indeed, when we're talking about the relationships between these three countries, we've always seen that Turkey has taken a neutral approach when it comes to the war in Ukraine. It has supported Russia as well, supported Ukraine as well. But obviously, Turkey does not recognize the annexation of Crimea. Mustafa, there's so many different aspects to this relationship, right? There's a war in Ukraine, which the Turkish government is working on, and it wants to end this war. But then again, Fidan was not just there for talks on the ceasefire. He was there for bilateral talks as well. They discussed the opening of the Akkuyu nuclear plant as well. So, they discussed trade. Hakan Fidan said that both sides have a very strong relationship when it comes to trade, investment, and education. So how are you looking at this aspect of bilateral ties? And tell me about the Akkuyu nuclear plant. When can we expect that to be inaugurated?
Mar, it is crystal clear that a geopolitical situation between Ukraine and Russia is not affecting bilateral relationships between Ankara and Moscow. As you know, in 2022, Russia launched its special military operation in Ukraine. And since then, many Western countries have been imposing sanctions on Russia. They are also calling on Turkey to participate in the sanctions for Russia. But Turkey didn't impose sanctions on Russia. And on the contrary, Turkey is determined to strengthen its bilateral cooperation with Russia in all fields, ranging from politics and economy to trade and military. And as you know, Turkey and Russia are right now cooperating on the Akkuyu nuclear power plant. It is still under construction in Turkey, and it is projected to increase Turkey's energy independence. It is a peaceful nuclear program for Turkey, and yesterday the Turkish and Russian decision makers said that Turkey and Russia will continue to cooperate on the energy field and many other fields. I hope that Turkey and Russia will be able to enhance their bilateral cooperation in all fields because Turkey and Russia are two important countries in the Eurasia region in terms of ensuring peace and stability in the region. I hope that both Turkey and Russia will continue to take further steps to strengthen their bilateral cooperation in terms of coping with the common security challenges in the Eurasia region.
Mustafa, thank you for that analysis. Now let's take a look at this news report and we'll be right back.
Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan is in Russia for high-level talks with President Vladimir Putin and Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, focusing on the Ukraine conflict and key regional developments. The visit follows recent discussions between Russian and Ukrainian officials in Istanbul that resulted in a major prisoner exchange. Fidan is expected to emphasize Turkey's continued commitment to securing a just and lasting peace in the Russia-Ukraine war and to reaffirm Ankara's readiness to serve as a mediator in future negotiations. The meetings are also covering bilateral relations, including cooperation in trade, energy, and tourism. During his visit, Fidan is holding additional talks with senior Russian officials such as Defense Minister Andrei Belousov and Presidential aide Vladimir Medinsky. The agenda includes regional and global issues, particularly developments in Syria, Gaza, and the South Caucasus. Turkey has long maintained dialogue with both Moscow and Kyiv, aiming to reduce tensions and promote diplomacy amidst ongoing hostilities.
Welcome back to the program. Now let's take a look at the front page of Daily Sabah. Mustafa, as we were discussing earlier, Turkey says it's ready for a new mediation, and now it's looking to mediate these tensions between Russia and Ukraine. Tell me the latest about this, Mustafa.
Well, since the very beginning of the crisis between Ukraine and Russia, Turkey has been taking a balanced approach to Ukraine-Russia war. Turkey has been always calling for diplomacy and dialogue between two warring sides to put an end to the ongoing conflicts in the region. Within this context, Turkey, as you know, is facilitating peace talks between Ukraine and Russia. 2 weeks ago, Turkey's cultural and financial capital, Istanbul, hosted key peace talks between Ukraine and Russia. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio also represented the United States at these important peace negotiations in Turkey. And yesterday, Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan also expressed Turkey's interest in another round of Istanbul talks between Russia and Ukraine, as he spoke at a news conference with his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov. Sergei Lavrov is also praising Turkey's diplomatic efforts to find a common way and common sense to reach any possible ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia or any peace deal. I hope that Turkey's diplomatic efforts will yield positive results in terms of ending ongoing conflicts in Eastern Europe.
Mustafa, there's a very interesting picture on the front page of Daily Sabah, which is Devlet Bahçeli meeting with the leaders of DEM party. Now, this is the terror-free Turkey initiative, of course, launched by Devlet Bahçeli himself last year in November. So tell me more about this. At what stage are we? And, you know, he's called for a century of unity. So what is that about?
Omar, as you mentioned, opposition nationalist movement party leader Devlet Bahçeli last year proposed terror-free Turkey initiative. And since then, the Turkish government has been taking steps to realize terror-free Turkey dreams. And within this context, in February, PKK terror groups jailed ringleader Abdullah Öcalan urged the separatist terror group to dissolve itself and lay down their weapons. And as you know, in April, PKK terror group announced its decision to disband itself and lay down their weapons. And within this terror-free Turkey initiative, yesterday, pro-PKK political party visited Nationalist Movement Party leader Devlet Bahçeli at the Turkish parliament. And following that meeting, Devlet Bahçeli stated that century of unity will be realized with the terror-free Turkey initiative. The Turkish government is also supporting terror-free Turkey initiative. As you also know, Turkey is pursuing a century of Turkey, and right now it is projected that new steps taken by both the Turkish government and opposition parties will help Turkey establish a century of Turkey and terror-free Turkey initiative.
Mustafa, some very interesting development here. Syria, Israel reportedly engaged in rare direct talks on security. Now we've seen when the Syrian government, the Syrian regime, let's say, was ousted earlier this year. It went to Russia. Bashar al-Assad fled to Russia, but there were still problems. There was the American support for terror groups. Then there was a reconstruction. Then, the return of refugees. But at the same time, there was another issue, which was Israel, because Israel was targeting Syrian military facilities. Now they have engaged in talks. What is this about? How are they communicating at this point when we know that the tensions are still high?
Well, I think that Israeli decision makers think that there is a geopolitical vacuum in Syria right now because, as you mentioned, country's long-time ruler and dictator Bashar al-Assad fled to Russia in December as the opposition forces took control of the country. And since then, Israeli security forces have been regularly targeting military infrastructure across Syria. And Israel is also occupying power in Syria right now because they are still holding Golan Heights, and it is internationally recognized as Syria's territory. And as you also know, Turkey's growing geopolitical influence in Syria is pushing Israel's buttons. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu went to the United States in April to meet with US President Donald Trump. He called on the United States to increase pressure on Turkey over the latest geopolitical situation in the war-torn country. But on the contrary, US President Donald Trump publicly sided with Turkey and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and he urged Israel to be reasonable to deal with its bilateral problems in the Middle East region. Right now, Azerbaijan, I think, is hosting talks between Turkish and Israeli decision makers to ensure peace and stability in the region. Both Turkey and Israel also reiterate that they don't want any military confrontation in Syria. And I think these type of talks between regional stakeholders are helping all leaders in terms of de-escalating the geopolitical tensions in the region. And these rare talks between Syria and Israel, I think that will yield positive results in terms of ensuring long-standing peace and stability in Syria.
Mustafa, thanks for that update. We'll continue to monitor all these stories and more because when it involves Russia, when it involves Turkey, Syria, and all of these regional countries, obviously that is going to impact Turkey in more than one ways. Now let's take a look at this news report and we'll be right back.
Chancellor Friedrich Merz said Germany and its allies have lifted restrictions on the range of weapons supplied to Ukraine. Russia responded that the move is dangerous and could jeopardize the efforts in bringing peace to the three-year-old war. Speaking at a European policy forum in Berlin, Merz said that there would no longer be any range restrictions for such weapons from Germany, Britain, and France or the US. Chancellor Merz also added that such efforts would grant Ukraine the opportunity to defend itself by attacking military facilities in Russia. Merz has been conducting official visits to NATO's northern borders across the Baltic region since the start of the week. The German chancellor did not mention whether Germany would supply Taurus missiles to Ukraine. Meanwhile, German Medi also reported that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is expected to visit Berlin on Wednesday.
Welcome back to the program. Political analyst and journalist Javed Rana is now joining us from the Pakistani capital. Javed, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Javed, we've seen how the Turkish government has been talking to leaders from all across the world. And the most important thing that we must realize right now is Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan's visit to Russia. He has met President Putin, Medinsky, who's the lead negotiator, and his counterpart, Sergei Lavrov. How are you looking at this development, Javed? And what do you think the Turkish government is doing at this point? Is it doing the right thing to, in order to establish a ceasefire? In which direction is the Turkish government going with this war?
I think before that, we have to see it in a broader context, which is that the US has failed in enforcing a ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia. That is a part of the reason. And now it looks like Donald Trump sounded very frustrated when he said that Putin has gone crazy. He's not listening to me, despite the fact that he had a 2 hours long discussions with him over phone. And he's doing something which was not very much to the spirit of the discussion that he had with him. So I think in that context, these are the renewed efforts on the part of the Turkey. And Turkey already, basically, you may recall, I think 2 developments we have to see in the background. The recent mediation efforts, arbitration efforts, which could not take off, unfortunately. And then just after this war, when it had started off back in 2022, I think Turkey put a lot of weight in this conflict in terms of resolving it in a peaceful manner. And I think this latest attempt is more important. Turkey is, in a way, kind of a bridge between the 2 extreme approaches, which is the Europe and the Russia. And so far as U.S. role is concerned, I find it more as an opportunist. The U.S. is looking for rare earths under Donald Trump's presidency, something they've been saying it. Donald Trump was insulting Ukrainian president, but when he bribed him that the rare earth agreement would be there in case you enforce some kind of ceasefire agreement with Russia and settlement of this war. Again, in that context, I think Turkey's perspective is different. It understands that these war theaters needs to be winded down, and like in a manner that Turkey did it in Syria, and in a similar fashion, Turkey wants some kind of a settlement of this issue. Because Turkey is not a kind of a player which has any vested political interest. It has a genuine security concern in the Black Sea. And I think out of those concerns, these are the renewed efforts. But we have to also see a bigger picture. The bigger picture is that the Russian President Putin is the most manipulative player in this entire conflict. He's not considering anything now at a time when Donald Trump basically is desensitizing this war theater all over the world in a manner that people are not taking him very serious. So he understands that the Americans have already stopped funding this war, funding Ukraine, and therefore he can occupy as much as territory he can occupy, and that is exactly what he has been doing. 20% Ukraine's territory already under the hold of Russia, and if you include Crimea, which was previously taken over by Russia, it's at 27%. And I think there are apprehensions, and some genuine apprehensions, that probably this 27% may go up to 50%, because if you look at the mindset of the President Putin, he believes that Ukraine is historically part of Russia and should be a part of Russia. Now, the international pressure is not there. So having a permanent deal between Ukraine and Russia at this particular point of time, it looks like something easier said than done.
Javed, let's talk about the Gaza issue, because during the press conference yesterday, Hakan Fidan and Sergei Lavrov both stressed on the need for a ceasefire in the occupied Gaza Strip, and both condemned the Israeli actions. And we've been seeing what is happening in the occupied Gaza Strip over the last 24 hours with that humanitarian aid. So how are you looking at Russia's role? You know, has Russia taken enough stance in stopping the war? How are you analyzing Russia's stance on the war in Gaza?
I think no country has benefited more than Russia out of this conflict in terms of exploiting it to let the West and let everybody else in the world to know that Israel's key ally, the USA and the West, they all have been talking about that it was a Russian aggression on Ukraine. But as a matter of fact, when they look at what Israel has done with the backing of the West, then the aggression of Russian president in Ukraine, that looks like a very small. In that context, I think that was a bigger benefit to Russian president. He was declared as a war criminal. There was arrest warrants issued by the International Criminal Court. But when similar situation happened in Gaza at a far larger scale, we have seen that again it was the West itself which sanctioned. I'm talking about the U.S. It sanctioned the International Criminal Court. It sanctioned its officials and bullied them and cornered them. So again, this helped Russia basically to do whatever it wants to do with the Ukraine, which is not a militarily powerful country. So whatever the statement Russia has been giving on Gaza, I do not take it very seriously because Russia has an interest in the Middle East. Russia wants to maintain its military bases in the Middle East. And Turkey is trying to play a role where it can navigate in so far as the interest of the West and so far as the interest of the Russians are concerned in a manner that is acceptable to all parties.
Javed, let's go back to the European stance, because yesterday Sergei Lavrov stressed on the fact that the European Union is not taking this issue seriously. He said that the European Union is using this war for its own personal benefits. How are you analyzing this statement by the Russian foreign minister?
Well, I think everything is in the disarray now because when USA has abandoned Ukraine in terms of not providing the high-tech weapons, and now it is Ukraine which is depending altogether on Germany, on France, and the UK, who've been providing them the weapons. Now they have also announced that they are going to provide long-range weapons. I think that is from Russia's perspective, and also I think the Turkish foreign minister has also voiced his concern that this could possibly lead towards a kind of a nuclear conflict in months or in years to come if the situation persists like this. Because long-range weapons means that there may be long-range missiles which Ukraine would be using to target deep inside Russia. So this conflict could prolong. And I think at this particular point of time, when regional countries like Turkey, when the USA, they are all ready to help Russia to go for some kind of a negotiated settlement, which obviously my understanding is that now Ukraine is more inclined to withdraw its candidacy to become member of the NATO. And I think probably it would not have much interest to become the member of the European Union. But again, the problem here is that how much territory Russia is going to retain and how much territory it is going to give in. So that is a critical question, and that is where Russian president, who is a KGB spy, he has got a very manipulative skills, and I think he is comprehensively exploiting everybody in the region and in the world. He's outsmarting everyone, and I think now his tactics looks like more meaningfully visible, and the European countries are feeling very, very frustrated. And so far as the US president is concerned, we cannot take him much serious. But again, he is also feeling very frustrated in this situation.
Mustafa, I'll come back to you now. Turkey has been balancing both the European Union and the United States when it comes to the war in Ukraine. Now, how is Turkey looking at the European response? Because like Javed said, that now Germany has said that, there's going to be no range on the missiles. You can hit Russia as much as you want. When you hear statements like these, and then when you see, the actions taken by the French and the British government in regards to the war in Ukraine, when they say, we'll have our own military force, how is Turkey looking at these statements when the European Union comes and says these things?
Well, right now, I think there are three different approaches to war between Ukraine and Russia. The first approach is the American one. The second approach is the European one. And the third approach is the Turkish one. As I mentioned about it, Donald Trump has been always calling for peace and dialogue between Ukraine and Russia. I think right now the United States wants immediate ceasefire between two warring sides and cessation of the conflicts in the region. And United States sometimes is eager to exclude Ukraine from the peace negotiations. But Russia's recent escalation in Ukraine also surprised US President Donald Trump, and he yesterday threatened more sanctions for Russia. On the other hand, the second approach is the European one, and the European nations are always reiterating their strong support for Ukraine's political sovereignty and territorial integrity. And right now, it seems that European countries are in favor of ongoing war between Ukraine and Russia. On the other hand, Turkey has been always prioritizing diplomacy and dialogue between two warring sides. And Turkey claims that if the international community wants to see peace and tranquility in the Eastern Europe, all warring sides will be supposed to sit at the same negotiating table. And Turkey's balanced approach to the Ukraine-Russia war, I think, is being praised by the international community. Within this context, Turkey is continuing to take steps to reach any ceasefire and peace deal between Ukraine and Russia, because Turkish decision makers reiterate at every opportunity that there will be no losers in just peace, and there will be no winners at the war. I think Turkey will continue to take steps to ensure just peace in Ukraine and Russia. On the other hand, 2 weeks ago, as you know, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan participated in the European Political Community Summit in Albania, and at that summit, President Erdogan called for unity and solidarity among the European nations to deal with the common security problems on the old continent. On the other hand, as you also mentioned, that the European Union is right now trying to establish its own military structure to deal with the security challenges in the continent. But on the other hand, Turkey has been always reiterating its support for Europeans' efforts to establish its own army. But Turkey also reiterates that European military structure shouldn't be separated from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, because Turkey is one of the most important countries of the NATO. But on the other hand, Turkey is not a member of the European Union, and Turkey doesn't want to be excluded from the European security structure. I think that Turkey's contribution to the European security will be understood by the European decision makers, and they will take steps in terms of ensuring long-standing peace and stability in Europe.
Javed, my final question is for you. Now, yesterday, Lavrov said that, they're having a good conversation, they're having peaceful conversations with the United States, and, they're close to, achieving a deal. What that deal incorporates, we do not know. But he said that the EU wants to damage our negotiation process. Considering the differences between Trump and the European Union, do you think that President Trump could abandon this plan entirely?
I don't think he would abandon the plan, because he sounded frustrated, and Moscow has not taken him seriously. That's why we have not heard a very strong wording from Moscow. And Moscow said essentially that it was an emotional overload. Because Moscow is trying to play it down. Now the problem with the Europe is that it has lost the war. It used tactics to basically to weaken militarily Russia, economically weaken Russia. That did not happen. It has in fact turned out to be counterproductive. Now in a kind of a frustration, it is providing weapons, but again, it doesn't have the much capacity to continue the supplies of these weapons. And then it doesn't have that kind of the intelligence resources. It doesn't have that kind of high-tech facilities with which it can sustain this war. On the other hand, the US has that capacity, and the US has, by and large, withdrawn its support. So therefore, Putin is expecting that at the end of the day, Donald Trump is going to put enough pressure on Ukrainian president, and then there would be a deal, and that deal would be largely on the terms and the conditions that Moscow would lay down.
Javed Rana, thank you for being on the program. It was a pleasure having you. Anews editor Mustafa Kojakanar, thanks to you as well. It was a pleasure listening to your analysis.
You're welcome.
That brings us to the end of our program. Thanks for joining us. Bye for now.